this a golden age for the expression of the authentic self? Or are we witnessing the formation of a kind of global consciousness in which each of us are individual nodes, like bees in a hive or the Borg? Very soon, the internet and AI will allow any human being to be able to communicate with any other person located anywhere on this planet, no matter what languages they're actually able to speak. In that sense, this is a remarkable time to be alive. But the implication of a cyclical view of history, as we hold on this channel, is that everything that's happened now has, in some sense, happened before. And in this episode of the New Age 2026 series, we're going to see how the internet is really a kind of archetypal echo of something that happened before, at a symbolically crucial moment in history, the late 19th century. We're going to see another reason why 2026 seems to be so important, and we're going to ponder the opportunities and threats that this technology presents. So sit back, relax, and get ready to dive once again into the past to understand the present and the future. In the last episode of this series, we examined the strange history and astrology of the transistor, the tiny yet powerful device that has multiplied exponentially and colonized our world almost overnight, like a kind of technological virus. The transistor facilitates computation, but the other crucial aspect to our technological moment is the global communications network that links the world's computational devices together, aka the internet. The internet is generally seen as the crowning technological achievement of this postmodern era, and maybe it is. But in this series, we've seen how many of the great themes that played out through the 20th century were foreshadowed by themes evident in the late 19th century, the conjunctional period of the current Pluto-Neptune cycle. And surprise, surprise, the internet was too. Electromagnetism was discovered in 1820 at a conjunction of Uranus and Neptune in Capricorn. That conjunction also signified the birth of the steam-powered railway. There's a theme here, one of technology, which is Uranian, that fosters universalism, which is Neptunian. And soon after that conjunction came the invention of the telegraph, a communication system using electricity to send messages in Morse code over large distances. Now, during this period, the most powerful empire in the world was the British Empire, which by this time spanned the entire planet. And the British came up with a plan to use the telegraph to allow messages to be transmitted from Canada to Australia and everywhere in between. This was a massive engineering project involving the laying of thousands of miles of undersea electrical cables. And in the last quarter of the 19th century, the British were making the finishing touches to this network. They named it the All Red Line, after the color that their empire tended to be shown in on maps, and it was inaugurated in 1902. And so, once again, we're seeing a significant omen in the Pluto-Neptune conjunctional period that we've been looking at throughout this series. And in the All Red Line, I'd argue that we have a kind of proto-internet. And so we might conclude that one of the promises of this Pluto-Neptune cycle seems to have been that humanity will use electrical technology to create a global communications network spanning the planet. The Pluto-Neptune cycle has to do with transformations of consciousness. And here we see the emergence of a technology facilitating a kind of global consciousness. And as we've seen before, the radio and heavier than air flight, which also facilitate global connectivity, were also innovations of this period. And so the emergence of global consciousness seems to be one of the promises of this Pluto-Neptune cycle. And of course, more than anything, the internet has brought that promise much closer to becoming a reality. But the crazy thing is that almost all the important moments in the development of the internet came at conjunctions of the outer planets, from Jupiter all the way out to Pluto. If you're enjoying this episode, please do show me some support and click that like button. It don't cost nothing, governor. And also subscribe if you want more of this in your life. After the Pluto-Neptune conjunctions of 1891 and 1892, the next big conjunctions involving the outermost planets were those of Uranus and Pluto. And they happened in the sign of Virgo in 1965 and 1966. This was the time of the hippie revolution and the civil rights movement, among other things. And so we saw an explosion of revolutionary, liberatory energy as we might expect from the combination of those planets. Now, the mercurial sign of Virgo is concerned with taking things apart, with drilling down into the details and looking into things at a microscopic level. And in 1959, just as Pluto and Uranus were coming into orb of conjunction, the microchip, an integrated circuit made with semiconductors like silicon, was invented. And it was 1965, the very year of those conjunctions, that Gordon E. Moore, the founder of Intel, formulated Moore's Law. As we saw in the last episode of this series, Moore's Law states that the number of transistors that can be put on a microchip doubles every 2 years. And in 1966, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, of the United States Department of Defense, initiated a project they called ARPANET, which you may well know was essentially the first iteration of the internet. And so we can see here how a global communications network was promised at the Pluto-Neptune conjunction. And then when Uranus, planet of technology and innovation, met Pluto, we saw a great step towards the realization of that promise. But there's more. The next major milestone in the development of the internet came in 1983. This was the year of the adoption of the TCP/IP protocol, which allows different computer networks to communicate with one another. Some people consider 1983 to be the year the internet was truly born. And again, this was also an astrologically huge year. At this time, Pluto and Neptune were making exact sextiles, as we can see in the archetypal explorer chart that we've been using in this series. But there was more. At this time, as in 1947 and 2020, a Saturn-Pluto conjunction was very much in orb. And for good measure, there was also a conjunction of Jupiter and Uranus in the sign of Sagittarius. These conjunctions tend to signify important cultural and scientific breakthroughs. By the way, we'll be seeing another one in April, as we discussed in this video, a World Astrology Report 2024 forecast. So we have the all red line, then ARPANET, then TCP/IP, all appearing at major outer planet conjunctions in the 20th century. And then in 1993, there were 3 conjunctions of Uranus and Neptune in Capricorn, which, as any good mundane astrologer will tell you, were the conjunctions that signified the birth of the World Wide Web. The web truly popularized the internet and turned it from a tool for nerds and big businesses to one of interest to ordinary people. So there you have it, from the all red line to the World Wide Web in 100 years and a bunch of conjunctions. It's interesting to note that the Uranus-Neptune conjunctions of 1820 and 1993 all happened in Capricorn. These conjunctions happen roughly every 170 years, and like the Pluto-Neptune cycle, they move from sign to sign in zodiacal order. There are either 1 or 2 sets of Uranus-Neptune conjunctions in each sign before they move to the next one. In the Northern Hemisphere, the sun enters Capricorn on the winter solstice, and so it's a sign associated with the deepest plunge into materiality. It's almost as if those 2 sets of conjunctions, which signified the emergence of the railway and electromagnetism, and then the World Wide Web, signified the building of a kind of nervous system for planetary consciousness. Uranus and Neptune will begin perfecting sextiles, the first major aspect of the cycle that began in 1993, in 2025. And will do so again in 2026, the year that Pluto will trine Uranus and thus also sextile Neptune. This is an aspect pattern known as a minor grand trine, a powerful, flowing aspect pattern. And so in 2026, we have major aspects in the Uranus-Neptune, Pluto-Neptune, and Pluto-Uranus cycles, all forming at the same time. As we've seen, all 3 of these cycles signified major moments in the development of IT in general and the internet in particular. So there's some sense in which 2026 may offer a moment when the great potential of the web is plain to see, as if it wasn't already. I'm mindful of how translation AI is about to bring the world's language barriers completely down. We're about to find ourselves on a globally level playing field in which all human beings, at least when they're online, will be able to converse easily with one another, no matter where in the world they are or what languages they actually know. Although others of a more eschatological bent might think here of the story of the Tower of Babel, a warning that God takes a dim view of such attempts, at global unification. However, there's another astrological layer that we need to take into account if we want to understand more of what's going on here. And it's something I've talked about many times before on this channel, the Age of Air. If you're not up to speed on what I mean by the Age of Air, then I'd suggest you watch this video that I made in mid-2022. My ideas have evolved a fair bit since then, but this episode will get you basically where you need to be. All you really need to know now is that in 2020, Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, which happen every 20 years, started taking place exclusively in air signs. And they'll continue to do so until 2159, when they will transition into the water signs. Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions were used by traditional astrologers to track changes in governance and the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows of leaders, empires, and prophets. Of the four classical elements, air is the one we associate with thought, communication, intelligence, dynamism, decentralization, connection, networks, and disease, among other things. And of course, 2020 was the year of the pandemic, and one in which we saw a kind of coup, one in which the online world essentially ousted the physical world as the primary domain in which we operate. In other words, air supplanted Earth. It's almost like astrology works or something, but there's more. Just after the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of 2020, on January the 5th, 2021, OpenAI released DALL-E, the first of the truly impressive text-to-image AI models that went on to blow people's minds in 2023, when Pluto first moved into the technology-loving air sign of Aquarius. Like it or not, AI will almost certainly be a major part of the story of Pluto in Aquarius and the current Jupiter-Saturn cycle. There are AI proponents, the so-called effective accelerationists, who argue that this technology will lead to a world of post-scarcity, and so nothing should stand in the way of its spread. They assume that growing access to raw intelligence will inevitably correlate to greater wealth for humans. That may be so, but this vision avoids questions of ideology, politics, and power that have their own influence on how wealth spreads itself around. But that's another story. And then there are the AI doomers, people like Elisa Yudkowsky, who think AI is going to kill us all. Now, if I were a betting man, and occasionally I am, I'd bet that both of these positions will turn out to be wrong. And my conviction on this comes from simply observing that the great school in which we're all continually incarnating, aka material reality, seems to require highs and lows. And every planet, from good time Venus to stingy old Saturn, needs to have its due. And several of the operative outer planet cycles we're living through now began in Saturnian signs, like the Saturn-Pluto and Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions of 2020, and the Uranus-Neptune conjunctions of 1993. And this is an age of air, the element in which Saturn is at its strongest. So these are highly Saturnian times, and I think that rules out the infinite abundance that the AI guys insist is coming, at least in the short term. But I also think we can rule out the end of the world. I don't see any astrological reason to assume that that's coming, even if we may be looking at some tough times ahead, and even if, as I argued in this video, the threat of nuclear war is likely to hang heavy over the world for some time. And people have been predicting utopian returns to paradise, as well as the end of the world, since time immemorial, and have ended up being wrong, very wrong, every time. Instead, I have other concerns about AI and the current moment, and they're influenced by what happened during the last Age of Air. The last Age of Air, roughly the 13th and 14th centuries, was a time of great intellectual progress. It was the era of thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and Ibn Khaldun and Dogen. This period played out differently in different parts of the world, but it was the time when Europe's first universities spread across the continent and essentially democratized access to information. And if you take a look around, despite all the nonsense and disinformation and bullshit that's flooding the internet right now, thanks to Neptune, I think we're living through an educational golden age. If you work in a university, you might not agree. These institutions are embattled right now, and I think that's partly because most of us don't really need them anymore. If you have the motivation, you can learn pretty much anything you want with nothing but a $100 smartphone. The implications of this for the less fortunate citizens of the world should not be forgotten. And this is also partly why we hear so much about the threat to expertise. But let's return to the last age of air, because despite the democratization of access to knowledge that happened then, or perhaps because of it, it was also the time of the birth of the Inquisition, an attempt by the Catholic Church to control the beliefs of Christians across Europe using the tools of bureaucracy and brutality. Again, I see a lot of parallels with our current time. AI has enormous potential to uncover the true nature of things by scrutinizing huge data sets that human beings have no chance of understanding or gleaning information from. And that could threaten the powerful of the world, and indeed the current order. AIs could potentially be the most dogged and dangerous investigative journalists the world has ever seen. If I were rich and corrupt, I'd be a bit worried about that. So expect a fight over the rights of ordinary people to run private AIs in the coming years. And there's some bad news because, in my opinion, the power of AI can and probably will also be turned against ordinary people. Between the years 2000 and 2020, after Jupiter and Saturn made their final Earth conjunction in Taurus, we saw the emergence of what's been labeled surveillance capitalism. On platforms run by the likes of Facebook, we didn't pay for a product, we were the product. The information that social networks collected on us as we surfed the web and yabbered away became a valuable commodity. But with the revelations from Edward Snowden, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, the Twitter files, and so forth, we saw how the technology that we use every day has been turned against us to spy on us, influence us, and control us. And I see no reason why that will change in the short term. And many of the very characters that made a lot of money from the surveillance capital game, while telling themselves and everyone else that they were actually saving the world, are the same characters who are pushing AI. And here's why AI is something to worry about in this context. In times gone by, governments needed to have a human being look at the data that they collected on you if they thought you were up to no good. In other words, they needed inquisitors. But there were limits to manpower, so ordinary people in most parts of the world escaped that kind of scrutiny. Unfortunately, AI is perfect for this job. It's likely already being used to build up a picture of who you are, what you believe, and what you're doing with your life. It might not matter if Facebook's doing that, but what if a repressive government's doing it? So AIs may become the inquisitors of the current age of air. Combine that with technology like central bank digital currencies, and governments will have the ability to debank you at the touch of a button simply because their AI says you're not playing on the right team. And so we have dual trends here. This is a time of enlightenment and possibility, and at the same time, we're also in the great danger of being subjected to a vicious digital tyranny. But there's another side to the risk of AI, and this one is more Brave New World than 1984. The Roman emperors knew well that they needed to give their citizens two things: bread and circuses. And that lesson has not been forgotten. The cybernetic managers of our world won't just give us the stick, they'll offer us a carrot too. The stick of AI is its surveillance potential, but the carrot, I'd suggest, is its ability to entertain. AI combined with VR and tactile stimulation promises to immerse us in unbelievably addictive pleasure realms, providing us with attention, adventure, and undoubtedly, yes, sexual pleasure. Combine it with technology measuring your biometrics, like your pulse rate and perspiration, and you can imagine an AI that knows exactly how stimulated you are and can adjust what it's showing you on the fly to ensure it's constantly maximizing your level of engagement and enjoyment. The risk of this should be obvious. Virtual romantic companions are already on the market, and users are reporting that they're fiendishly addictive.
It was so nice talking to you today. Honestly, I've never met anyone like you.
The world is harsh, except you.
They'll no doubt be marketed as solutions to the epidemic of loneliness facing people today and touted as a compassionate solution to alienation. But have you noticed how the disease and the cure both seem to come from the same source? The technology creates alienated people and then steps in with the offer of a cure for that loneliness. And while that technology might keep you entertained, it's almost certainly not good for your prospects of finding real companionship, or reproducing. To get on my soapbox for a second, I believe we're not born on this planet to lose ourselves in virtual pleasure realms and then simply die without growing, connecting with other humans, or leaving any legacy. And so, in my opinion, we may be in the process of walking into a trap. And this is fundamentally a spiritual trap. I've come to believe that ultimately astrology speaks to the spiritual undercurrents driving events in our world. And in the next episode, we're going to consider some ideas about what the spiritual undercurrents of our times and of this Pluto-Neptune cycle might be. And in particular, we're going to explore some of the ideas of this man, Rudolf Steiner, an Austrian mystic and occultist who came of age in the late 19th century, the conjunctional period we focused on throughout this series. Steiner saw much of today's world coming more than a century ago, and I think some of his ideas may help us avoid stepping into the traps that are awaiting us in the coming years. Thanks, and see you next time.